Welcome back, and it's time for Unit 7, Lecture 2 on the cycling of matter. In the last unit lecture, Lecture 1, we talked about how energy flows or gets cycled throughout the ecosystem. It comes from the sun, gets turned in and stored in organic compounds by the producers, which then get eaten by consumers, which get eaten by more consumers, and eventually, after the animals die, they get decomposed by the decomposers. In this unit, we're going to look at how other things cycle. Now, the one cycle you're probably most familiar with is the water cycle, and we will talk about the water cycle more in the second half of the year when we start talking about meteorology and cloud formation. Here, we're going to look at the cycling of matter. Other types of matter besides water, we're going to look at the cycling of three elements. We're going to look at the cycling of carbon, the cycling of phosphorus, and the cycling of nitrogen. First up, we're going to look at the carbon cycle, cycling of the element carbon. Carbon cycle is just as it sounds, it's the movement of carbon between living and non-living things. All right, we know carbon's essential. Carbon is the main atom that makes up all organic molecules, including proteins, fats, carbohydrates like sugar. All of this stuff we need. We can find carbon in air, water, living organisms. Also, other non-living things like rocks can contain carbon, or coal. Producers pull carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into carbohydrates. So they convert carbon dioxide, which has carbon in the atmosphere, and they convert it into carbohydrates during photosynthesis. And then we take those carbohydrates as consumers as we eat the producers. After we eat the carbohydrates, after we eat the producers and get those carbohydrates in our bodies, we perform cellular respiration, where we take the carbon and we release it back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Some animals take the carbon and make hard shells out of some of the carbon compounds in a mineral called calcite, which is the main component of limestone. And limestone itself, the sedimentary rock limestone, is considered a carbon sink, or a place of carbon storage. All right, that is on Earth. So carbon that's not stored as fats and oils or other molecules eventually will get released into the soil or air as the organism dies and the decomposers kind of break it down. If these organic molecules get trapped underground, if they are subject to enough heat and pressure, they could form deposits of coal, oil, or natural gas, which are the fossil fuels which we use to power many of our automobiles and other machines with engines. And so as we burn the fossil fuels, we return carbon to the atmosphere. Here is a picture of that carbon cycle. All right, I believe you have this in your notes. You can start anywhere. So let's start up here. We have carbon dioxide up in the air. All right, through photosynthesis. All right, the trees and grasses and plants take the carbon, turn it into carbohydrates, which then get eaten by the animals. The animals then re-release that carbon to the air through respiration. They take the carbohydrates, they turn it into carbon dioxide and water, breathe out the carbon dioxide, it goes back to the atmosphere. So that forms one part of the cycle. Another part of the cycle is the carbon dioxide in the air can dissolve in water, or it can come out of water and enter the atmosphere. It's in a state of equilibrium. So net, the amount of water or carbon dioxide in water and the amount of carbon dioxide in the air stays relatively balanced, but they are switching places all the time. Another thing that happens after the photosynthesis and the organisms eat it, decomposition can happen, or dead animals and plants could end up at the bottom of a river or lake, or die and be decomposed on the ground and the soil. Over time, that gets buried and can turn into oil, natural gas, and coal. We then take oil, natural gas, and coal, and we burn it for heat and energy, which releases carbon dioxide back into the air. And so over the entire world, we make up this cycle of carbon called the carbon cycle. We, as humans, affect the carbon cycle because we burn those fossil fuels and we release carbon dioxide into the air. All right, now what we do know is that carbon dioxide itself is a greenhouse gas, along with others like water vapor, methane. There's other greenhouse gases, but it traps and absorbs and re-radiates infrared energy. Now, infrared energy itself is known as heat or heat energy, and so this contributes to climate change. All right, notice I'm using climate change, not the words global warming. Global warming, I think, while on a broad scale, if you look at the whole Earth, the reason they called it global warming was because the average temperature of the entire Earth is starting to rise slightly. The average temperature of the entire Earth. That does not mean that every place on Earth is getting warmer all the time. So if you hear somebody on like a really cold day in, say, October or September or something, say something like, oh, how about that global warming if we get like an unusual cold spell? Well, that's one day in one location on Earth. All right, we could have tests in here where the average of the test could be 85, 90 points on that test. And that's happened. All right, but also things that have happened on that test if people have been in the 50s or 60s. Now, for those people, it was not a good test. All right, if I say it's the best test we've had this year and somebody looks at a 60, they're like, well, not for me. They're right. Just talking average-wise is how we kind of get into this situation. That's why I like climate change better, and as we move through the year and get into weather, meteorology, climate, we'll talk more about that. Second element we're going to talk about is nitrogen, carbon's neighbor on the periodic table, and the nitrogen cycle. All right, now, like the carbon cycle, which talks about carbon being circulated around an ecosystem through the air, the water, the soil, the rocks, the plants, and the animals, the nitrogen cycle is the same thing, but it's a process in which the element nitrogen cycles. All right, just like carbon is needed to build all organic molecules, nitrogen is needed to build proteins, which are used to build new cells, used in DNA replication, DNA synthesis, so very important. Now, luckily here on Earth, nitrogen's very abundant. It makes up 78% of the atmosphere. However, very few organisms can use nitrogen in that manner. Nitrogen has to be altered. They call it fixed, all right, so that organisms can use it. And there's only a few very special species of bacteria that can fix nitrogen into a type of chemical compound that can be used by other animals, used by other organisms, and we call these organisms nitrogen fixing bacteria because they are bacteria that fix nitrogen. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria, as their name imply, fix nitrogen, but what they do is they convert nitrogen from the atmosphere into ammonia or an ammonia-like compound. And we can find these bacteria at the roots of the legumes, which are a type of plant, and those are tasty plants like beans and pea plants, but also clover. House these bacteria in their roots, and the bacteria use sugar from the plant, and then the plant uses the nitrogen compounds such as ammonia and nitrates. And extra nitrogen that gets fixed eventually gets re-released into the soil, or gets released out into the soil for other plants to use. All right, here's the beautiful picture of the nitrogen cycle. So right here, here's our plant. All right, here's our atmospheric nitrogen. Remember, 78% of the atmosphere. Now, there's a couple things that can happen. All right, first off, can end up, the air can get everywhere, so it gets around the roots of a legume here, like a bean plant or a pea plant here, being eaten by Bambi, let's say. All right, and those nitrogen-fixing bacteria turn the nitrogen into a usable form. Some of that gets used directly by this plant. Some other, some leftover nitrogen that got fixed ends up in the soil, which could be taken up by a tree, like this tree here. So we have the nitrogen-fixing bacteria making ammonia, which can then be used by other bacteria, used by this tree or any of the grasses you see off there. And then as that happens, it eventually gets re-released into the air. Another thing that can happen, the nitrogen can dissolve into water, and there's bacteria in water that can process nitrogen. Or nitrogen can be in the air, and lightning itself will convert some of the nitrogen into nitrates. So just the lightning itself, going through the air, there's so much energy in there, it causes spontaneous chemical reactions of some of the nitrogen in the air, which will then get used by the plants. Decomposers are also a big influence in the nitrogen cycle. As we die and other organisms die, nitrogen stored in our bodies, or the bodies of the once living thing, get returned to the air, because the decomposers will break down the decaying plant now, so it'll break down the dead stuff, also breaks down waste. All right, and as this happens, the decomposers return nitrogen to the soil. All right, some bacteria return it to nitrogen gas, which then goes up into the atmosphere and completes the cycle. Other times the nitrogen gets reused right from the soil. So decomposers also play a role in returning some of the nitrogen to the atmosphere. The final element cycle we'll talk about is phosphorus, which happens to live right below nitrogen on the periodic table. And it is also a part of many molecules that make up the cells of living organisms. It's not a part of all organic molecules like carbon, or not a part of all important molecules or all proteins like nitrogen is, but phosphorus is still important. And for the most part, plants get phosphorus from soil and water, and we'll talk about how that happens in a little bit. Animals get phosphorus by eating plants, or other animals that have eaten the plant. So we get our phosphorus either by eating a plant or eating another animal, much of the same way that we get our carbohydrates. So the nitrogen cycle showed how nitrogen cycles around an ecosystem. The carbon cycle showed how carbon cycled around an ecosystem. The phosphorus cycle shows how phosphorus moves around an ecosystem, around the environment, from the environment to organisms, and then back from organisms to the environment. The main way that phosphorus enters soil water is rock erosion. All right, so rocks erode and small parts of phosphorus dissolve in a chemical compound known as a phosphate, which then gets into the soil, water, and groundwater. Plants take these phosphates from the soil in their roots and move them up the body. Some phosphorus ends up in water. All right. Now the big thing is sometimes phosphorus, salts of phosphorus, phosphate compounds. All right, because the word salt implies that there's some large ion, in this case a phosphate ion, attached to some kind of metal. Or you hear salt and you think of putting stuff on your French fries. Salt is a whole family of chemical compounds. So there are some phosphate compounds that are not soluble in water. They won't dissolve in water. All right, so they do not dissolve. So they don't dissolve in water, and then they sink to the bottom and accumulate as a sediment and become a rock again. And then that rock gets broken down by erosion and weathering and gets re-added to the soil and water. And that's one way the cycle happens. But the other way is the plants absorb this the phosphorus, the phosphates of soil, and then they use. And so here we see another little flow chart of what is going on. Notice there is no air component in this case because there's very little phosphorus in the air. Phosphorus very, very rarely occurs as a gas. 99.9% of the time, phosphorus is in some kind of solid form. Could be in the rocks or could be in fertilizer. And so weathering from the rocks and erosion from the rocks brings phosphate out of the rocks, might put it in water. Decomposition of dead plants and animals adds phosphorus in phosphates to the soil or to the water. Fertilizers, which a lot of fertilizers are just animal wastes, contain phosphates, and then it can get into the land of the soil. And in this area, it can build up. It gets used by the plants, and then as the plants die, it gets returned to the soil or the rocks. The soil or the water. And then as the phosphate builds up in the water, some of it forms new rocks that eventually will undergo weathering and erosion and put the phosphate back in the water. And so you have a little bit different cycle that doesn't involve air. Unfortunately, we add fertilizer to our soil, and fertilizer contains nitrates and phosphates. And so adding fertilizers, which help get us the maximum possible plant growth, like if you want an award-winning tomato at the county fair, we've added a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus to the soil. Well, if we add too much fertilizer, all that nitrogen and phosphorus doesn't get absorbed by the plants. It actually leaches into the soil. It can get into the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, mostly through runoff. So if you get a lot of rain, and we see this a lot in the Great Lakes area, not the Great Lakes area, the Finger Lakes area, all right, where some of the hills have a lot of farms or a lot of, farms. Have a lot of farms on them where people are growing crops. And so they add fertilizers. And then through runoff, after it rains, this nitrogen and phosphorus comes into the water. And so we have an excess of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. And if it helps plants, it's probably going to help aquatic plants, sometimes known as algae. All right, and if there's too much algae, what ends up happening is that the oxygen supply of that water source, of that aquatic ecosystem, gets cut off, and we start seeing a mass die-out of fish and other aquatic organisms, and even other nutrients. And so as nitrogen and phosphorus build up in water, we start to see a decrease in maybe some of the larger organisms because of a lot of algae growing at once. The Finger Lake Honeoye Lake turns green at the end of July, early August. Sometimes it gets really bad, and it's just because of so much algae from all the runoff. All right, it's a process known as Eutrophication. It's not a word you need to know right now. Maybe we'll talk about it later this year. All right, there are implications of us adding nitrogen and phosphorus to the soil to help get bigger, better crops and maximize our yields. That is it for lecture 2. Again, if you have any questions, bring them in. You know what to do with them. And have a nice night.